The ship was already moving when I realized no one had come to say goodbye. I stood at the small oval window in my cabin and watched the dock lights of New Geneva shrink into nothing. The city glittered below like spilled salt across black fabric, and then the cloud swallowed it, and then there was only the dark between stars. No one had waved, no one had stood on the platform and watched the transport lift. My mother had sent a message through her assistant, a 4-line note wishing me safe passage and reminding me not to speak unless addressed first. My father had not sent anything at all. My name is Sira Voss. I am 23 years old, and I was on my way to the court of the vampire king, not because anyone wanted me there, because my sister had gotten sick. Calla Voss was the daughter my parents had built their hopes around. She was tall, graceful, and knew exactly how to walk into a room so that every head turned. She had been trained since the age of 12 for this, the role of human envoy to the Vale court on Nocturne. The Vale were the oldest civilization in the known galaxy. They did not conquer worlds with weapons. They absorbed them with agreements called blood pacts, and humanity had signed 130 years before I was born. Every decade, a human representative traveled to the Ash Spire, the great floating court above Nocturne's dark side, to renew the terms and present tribute. This time it was supposed to be Calla. Then 4 days before departure she collapsed. The medical team said it was a rare neurological inflammation. Painful, non-fatal, but completely disabling. She could not stand. She could not speak clearly. She certainly could not travel across 6 light years to negotiate with beings who had been alive since before humanity discovered fire. My parents spent one night in a panic and one morning making a decision. They called me into my father's study. My father, Gregory Voss, was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of careful expression that never told you what he was actually thinking. My mother, Diane, stood beside his chair the way she always did, not quite next to him, not quite behind, just slightly out of frame. They looked at me the way people look at an old piece of furniture that they are not sure is worth keeping. You will go in Cale's place, my father said. I waited for more. There was no more. They won't notice the difference, my mother added, which was her way of explaining that no one at the Vale court would care enough about the human envoy to check whether she matched her registration files. Just stand in the reception hall, present the tribute token, and say nothing you haven't rehearsed. The court scribes handle the documentation. You barely have to exist. I had spent the last 6 years studying the Vale, not because my parents asked me to, not because there was any expectation that I would ever use the knowledge. I did it because I was the kind of person who, when given an empty afternoon in a library, could not stop reading. I had read every available Vale diplomatic text, every translated historical record, every academic paper published by the small community of human xenolinguists who had managed to learn even fragments of the Vale language. I could read formal script. I could speak 3 of its 7 regional dialects, including the archaic court dialect that had not been used publicly in over a century. I did not tell my parents any of this. All right, I said. My father blinked as if he had expected resistance and was mildly disappointed not to get it. My mother looked relieved. Neither of them asked me a single question, not whether I was frightened, not whether I had any Questions, not even what I planned to pack. The night before I left, I sat on my bedroom floor surrounded by 7 notebooks and a portable data reader loaded with 300 files on Vale, political history, court etiquette, biological sociology, and the current composition of the Ash Spire's inner council. I did not sleep. I read until the sky outside my window turned gray. And then I packed my bags and walked to the transport dock alone. The ship was called the Meridian Cross. It carried 12 passengers, 4 diplomats from other human families, 2 trade ship observers, a pair of journalists who had 1 press lottery access, and me. None of them spoke to me. I was the Voss girl, the spare, the one who had shown up instead of the real envoy. The diplomatic team lead, a round-faced man named Colin Hurst, who had made this journey twice before, glanced at me during the first briefing session and said, "Just stay in the background and don't do anything interesting." I wrote that down in my notebook, not because it was useful, but because I thought someday it might be funny. The journey took 9 days. I spent them reading. I had already known most of what was in the briefing packets. What the packets did not contain was the political information I had gathered through my own research, the internal tensions in the Vale court, the aging disagreements between the old noble houses, the faction led by a lord named Drassic, who had for the last decade been quietly pushing for a reclassification of humanity from tributary species to resource species. The difference between those 2 categories, in Vale legal terminology, was the difference between a neighbor and a supply chain. Nobody on the Meridian Cross seemed to know about this, or if they knew, they had decided it was above their concern. I wrote 14 pages of notes on the subject and said nothing to anyone. On the 9th day, through the small oval window in my cabin, I watched Nocturne come into view. It was not what I had expected, which was strange because I had read every description of it I could find. The planet was enormous, nearly twice the size of Earth, and it did not rotate. One side always faced its dim red sun, a burnt copper wash of heat and stone. The other side faced permanent darkness, and it was on that side that the Vale lived. In the darkness against the black, the Ash Spire blazed. It was a city station, kilometers wide, suspended above the planet's surface by technology that human scientists still did not fully understand. It was made of something that looked like dark glass, and it caught the light of distant stars and held it so that from space it looked like a living constellation. I pressed my hand flat against the window and felt the cold of the glass against my palm. No one had wanted me on this ship. No one had thought it mattered which Voss girl showed up, or whether she was prepared, or whether she was afraid. I was afraid. I was also ready. Those 2 things I had learned were not opposites. The docking procedure took 2 hours. When the airlock finally opened and the air of the Ash Spire entered, the arches were lost shadow. The walls were dark stone, veined with something faintly luminous, and the floor was polished to a mirror shine. Along both sides of the hall stood the Vale, tall, pale, absolutely still, dressed in layered robes of gray and black and deep violet. They watched us enter the way you watch something you have seen 100 times before and have long since stopped finding interesting. I walked behind Colin Hurst and the other diplomats and said nothing, but I looked at everything. I read the insignia on the robes of the council members nearest the door and identified 4 of the 7 inner seats. I noted which veil were watching us with neutrality and which were watching with something sharper. I found near the back of the hall on an elevated platform that the other humans had not yet noticed, a single figure standing apart from the rest. He was not wearing the layered robes of the council. He wore something simpler, dark, close-fitting, without insignia or decoration. He was very still and very tall, and he was watching our group with an expression I could not immediately read, not boredom, not hostility, something more careful than either. I had read descriptions of Kael Dravon, king of the Vale, ruler of Nocturne for 412 years. The descriptions were all different. None of them had been adequate. He was looking at our group, and then for one moment that lasted exactly long enough for me to be certain it was not accidental. He was looking at me. I looked back. His expression did not change. Mine did not either. Colin Hurst was already launching into the formal greeting script. His pronunciation of the vow ceremonial opening phrase, technically correct but tonally flat, the way a person sounds when they have memorized words in a language they do not speak. I stood behind him and thought about everything I had read, everything I had prepared, everything I had not yet had a reason to use. That reason I thought was coming. I did not know yet how soon. The first full day in the Ash Spire was designed to be manageable, a series of formal reception events, a tour of the outer court galleries, a shared meal that was technically ceremonial and practically test of how well the human delegation could eat in silence without embarrassing anyone. I managed the meal. The journalists could not. One of them knocked over a ceremonial water vessel, and the sound it made hitting the stone floor rang through the room like a small disaster. The Val nearest to it did not move. They simply looked. That kind of stillness, I was beginning to understand, was not politeness. It was disdain with very good posture. I spent the first day in the correct position, slightly behind the diplomats, slightly to the left, visible but not prominent, and I used every moment of it to observe. The Ash Spire operated on a hierarchy I had studied in theory and was now mapping in practice. The inner council held the actual administrative power. The noble houses occupied the outer rings of the court and spent most of their energy on the internal social politics that seemed to consume a significant percentage of Val daily life. Then there were the lower court functionaries, scribes, attendants, translators, who moved through the halls quickly and quietly, the way people move when they have learned that being noticed is rarely good for them. And then there were the other alien delegations. They were not what the briefing packets had called them. The packets had used words like allied species and partner civilizations. What they actually were was a ranked social order wearing diplomatic clothing. The Queth, tall, serpentine beings with scales that shifted color with their mood, occupied the highest non-veil position in the court and were extremely aware of it. They looked at the human delegation with the particular expression of someone who has been waiting for the least important people to arrive. The sorrow, crystalline, geometric, slower moving, were technically neutral, but aligned practice with the Queth on most political questions. At the afternoon reception, one of the senior Queth diplomats, a tall figure whose scales were running a steady, arrogant gold said something in Queth to his companion, while looking in my direction. The comment was not flattering. It was a joke about the size of the human delegation's brains relative to the size of their ambitions, delivered in a dialect that the translator device on Colin Hurst's wrist would render as nothing. The device was calibrated for the trade dialect, not this one. I understood every word. I said nothing. I filed it away. I watched his companions' scales flicker in amusement and made a note of both their court insignia. There would be a moment to use that knowledge. Not yet. The second day was harder. An emergency session of the Inner Council was called in the early morning hours, before the human delegation had been formally informed of anything. I found out because I had been awake before sunrise. I rarely slept well in new places, and I heard the movement in the corridor outside my room. Footsteps, quick and purposeful, the specific cadence of people moving towards something urgent. I dressed quietly in. When to find out what it was, this was not technically within the approved activities for a human envoy. The approved activities were attend scheduled events, remain in designated areas, and refrain from doing anything that could be interpreted as gathering intelligence. The problem with that last instruction was that I was constitutionally incapable of not gathering intelligence. It was how I existed in the world. I noticed things. I wrote them down. What I found by following the sound of the footsteps to the outer edge of the council corridor and pressing myself into a shadowed alcove that I had memorized from the architectural diagrams in my files was a scene I had hoped I would not find for at least a few more days. Lord Drac was speaking. He was smaller than I had imagined from his official records, compact, angular, with the particular energy of someone who had been patient for a very long time and was running out of patience. He was addressing 4 council members in rapid formal veil. The legal dialect, and what he was saying was a structured argument for the emergency reclassification of humanity as a resource species on the grounds of evidence he claimed to possess showing human military buildup in violation of the blood pact terms. My hands went cold. I stood in the alcove and listened to every word. I did not have my notebook. I had left my room too quickly, so I did what I had trained myself to do in the years when notebooks were not available. I listened with the part of my mind that was essentially a recording device, running a continuous loop, committing language and inflection and argument, structured to memory with the focused discipline of someone who has had to learn to be their own archive. Drac did not have evidence tonight. What he had was a framework, a legal theory built on a foundation he was planning to construct over the next several days. He was laying the groundwork. He was telling the council members to be ready for a formal presentation within the week. He was very good at this. He had clearly done it before with other species. What he had not accounted for was that someone in the alcove could understand him. I went back to my room and wrote for 3 hours without stopping. By the time the ash spire's internal lighting shifted to indicate morning, I had 8 pages of reconstructed notes. The argument structure, the legal terminology Drazik had used, the names of the council members he was targeting, and most importantly, the specific treaty clause he was planning to invoke. I knew that clause. I had read the original treaty in its first draft veil Form, a document that existed in exactly one archive on Nocturne and had not been translated into any human language. The clause had a counter provision. Drazik either did not know about it or was betting that no human would. I sat back and looked at my 8 pages of notes, and I thought about Colin Hurst telling me to stay in the background and not do anything interesting. I put the cap back on my pen and thought very quietly that this was going to become interesting whether anyone wanted it to or not. The third day brought what I had been dreading most, not the political threat, not the covert schemes, but the social gauntlet of the formal cross-species reception, a multi-hour event in the Grand Hall where every delegation mixed freely, and the only rule was that you had to make it through without disgracing your species. Human delegation wore their best. Colin Hurst had a suit that cost more than my annual personal budget. The 2 trade observers wore matching formal gray. I wore Cala's second-best outfit, a deep blue dress that was slightly too long for me and had been taken in at the waist by a Meridian Cross crew member who had done her best with limited time. It was fine. I was not there to be admired. The Queth diplomat whose scales had run gold during the previous days joke was at the reception. I found him early and placed myself on a path he would naturally take toward the refreshment table. When he passed me, I said in his own language and the exact dialect he had used the previous day, something that translated roughly as, "Your court insignia indicates you are from the northern house of Quelrith. I studied your house's contribution to the Galactic Accord of 2241 in some depth. Your ancestors negotiated that treaty's 9th clause, which is still considered a masterwork of interspecies legal writing." He stopped. He looked at me. His scales went from gold to a complicated layered silver that in Queth indicated extreme surprise overlaid with rapidly recalculating respect. "You speak our language," he said. "I speak several," I said pleasantly and moved on. It was a small moment. It changed nothing strategically, but it was mine and I had been waiting for it, and when I turned away I allowed myself exactly 3 seconds of private satisfaction before I put my face back into its careful, neutral expression and went back to work. That evening I found the water in my bedside carafe smelled wrong. It was subtle, a faint mineral sharpness beneath the standard purification scent. I had read about Vale neurotoxins extensively, partly out of academic interest and partly because I was the kind of person who read about things that could kill me as a matter of precaution. There was a compound called Veleth, colorless, nearly odorless, used historically in Vale court politics during periods of factional conflict. The mineral sharpness was a byproduct of its synthetic production. Natural water never smelled like that. I set the carafe down very carefully. I went to the small attached lavatory and drank from the tap, which was on a separate system. Then I sat on the edge of my bed and breathed for a moment. Someone knew I was a problem. I was not frightened, or rather I was frightened, and I had learned long ago that being frightened and being capable were not mutually exclusive. I opened my notebook to a fresh page and wrote down everything: the smell, the probable compound, the list of people who had access to my room, the timing, the implication. Then I added it to the growing file I was building on Lord Drazik and his operation. I did not report it to Colin Hurst. He would have panicked, demanded an investigation and given Drazik the information that his message had been received. That was exactly what Drazik would want, confirmation that the human delegation was rattled. I was not going to give him that. I locked my door, wedged a chair under the handle, and went asleep. In the morning I felt Kale Dravan's gaze on me during the formal morning address, the way you feel the sun on your face before you have opened your eyes to look at it. I turned and he was already looking somewhere else, and I thought, you are watching me, and I do not yet know why, and that is the most interesting thing that has happened on this trip. I opened my notebook and started a new page. At the top I wrote his name. Below it I wrote one question: what does a 400-year-old king find worth watching? Then I sat in the formal address hall, the only human in the room who understood every language being spoken around her, and I waited to find out. The message came on the fourth morning. It was delivered by a court attendant, a young veil with silver-gray eyes, who appeared at my door before the ash spire's lights had fully brightened, and said, in perfectly neutral tones, that I was requested in the Northern Observatory at the second bell of the morning watch. No name was given, no explanation. I had been awake for an hour already, drinking plain water from the tap and reviewing my notes. I read the message twice, noted the specific wording: request not summoned, not invited, which were both terms with precise protocol meanings in Vale court language, and then I dressed, picked up my notebook, and went. The Northern Observatory was at the far end of the ash spire's upper level, past the council chambers and the formal archive rooms, and a long corridor of old portraits that were not portraits of people but of events, vast astronomical occurrences rendered in dark pigments on stone panels. I walked past a rendering of a supernova, past something that might have been a galactic collision, past an image I recognized as the formation of Nocturne's dark hemisphere. I had read about this corridor. I had not expected it to feel like walking through the memory of a civilization. The observatory itself was a wide, circular room with walls made entirely of a material that was either glass or something that functioned like glass, offering a view in all directions down to the surface of Nocturne's dark side, which was absolute black, broken only by the geological bioluminescence of deep Earth organisms across to the distant stars and upward into the full spread of the ash spire's undercarriage, its lights burning quietly in the void. Kale Dravan was standing at the far edge of the room, looking down at the planet surface. He was wearing these same silken little dark clothing I had seen on the first day, without insignia or ceremony. He did not turn when I entered, but he spoke. He spoke in archaic court Vale, not the modern dialect, not the trade language, the court formal register preserved in texts I had found in a single academic archive that had been partially digitized by a human professor who had spent 30 years reconstructing it. He said, I was told you would require a translator device. I crossed the room and stopped at a reasonable distance. I said in the same dialect, in what I hoped was an accurate approximation of the formal register's tone. You were told incorrectly. He turned. I had seen him from across the reception hall from a distance for a combined total of perhaps 8 minutes. Seeing him at close range was a different experience. He was very tall, not unusually so for a Vale, but the stillness of him made it more apparent. His features were the kind of angular that only comes with enormous age, not in the deterioration of aging, but in the opposite, a refinement as if centuries had stripped away everything unnecessary. His eyes were a color I did not have a word for in any language I spoke, dark with a quality of depth. That was not a metaphor, as if looking at them was looking into something that extended further than eyes should extend. He was looking at me with the same expression I had noticed on the first day, careful, attentive, the expression of someone who has been surprised and is deciding whether to show it. How long have you studied our language? He asked. 6 years, I said. And your family knows this? No. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, far below us, a thread of deep earth bioluminescence pulsed once in. Went dark. Sit, he said. It was not an order, it was an invitation in the archaic register, which used the same word but with a different tonal marker. I sat in the chair nearest the window and put my notebook on my knee. He looked at the notebook. You take notes constantly? I said. Why? It was such a direct question that for a moment I was not sure how to answer it. Then I said, because I have learned that memory is unreliable, and what I know is the only resource I have that no one can take from me, so I maintain it. Carefully he considered this. He moved to the chair across from me. Not the way people move when they are being deliberate, but the way people move when motion is so familiar it requires no thought. He was quiet for a long time, and it was not the uncomfortable silence of someone who does not know what to say. It was the silence of someone with enormous patience, considering where to begin. You are not who the records say you are, he said finally. I am Saravas. I said, the records say I am Calavas. That is incorrect. I know, he said. I looked at him. I identified the discrepancy within the first hour of your delegation's arrival, he said. The bone structure does not match. The movement patterns do not match. Your dossier photograph was submitted 6 years ago. In that photograph, the subject's hands are positioned in the manner of someone trained in formal gesture protocol. Your hands are never in that position. You hold them like someone who spends a great deal of time writing. I glanced down at my hands. He was right. I had never noticed. You are not a diplomat, he said. I am not. I agreed. Then what are you? The question sat between us for a moment. Outside the observatory, the stars moved at the pace of geological time. Indifferent and steady. I am the person who showed up, I said. Something shifted in his expression, not a smile exactly, but the structural suggestion of one brief and contained, there and then gone. And why did you show up without identifying yourself correctly? Because no one asked, and because I had a feeling it was going to matter that someone with the right preparation was here. I paused. I think Lord Drazik is planning to present fabricated evidence against humanity within the next 3 to 4 days. I have reconstructed his argument structure from a council corridor conversation I overheard on the first night. I also believe I was the target of a poisoning attempt on the 3rd night, though the method was unsophisticated and easily identified. I suspect it was a precautionary measure on Drazik's part, a way of removing the one person in the human delegation who might cause him difficulty, which suggests he did some research and found my academic work on Vale history, which I published under a pseudonym in a Xenolinguistics Journal 3 years ago. I opened my notebook to the relevant section and held it out. He took it. He turned the pages with a careful attention of someone who actually reads. Rather than skims, he read all 8 pages of my reconstructed notes, and then he closed the notebook and held it for a moment before returning it. You wrote this from memory, he said after single overheard conversation. Yes, in our legal dialect it is the most precise dialect for capturing argument structure. The grammar enforces logical sequencing. Another silence. This one felt different from the first, denser, more charged, as if the air in the room had changed pressure without physically moving. You expected no rescue, he said. It was not a question. I am human, I said. We don't wait for rescue, we make plans. He stood then, which ended the seated portion of our conversation in a way that was formal without being dismissive. He moved back to the window and looked down at Nocturne's dark surface. I stayed where I was. Come to this observatory tomorrow, he said, at the same time. All right, I said, and bring the rest of your notes. I stood, tucked my notebook under my arm, and walked to the door. At the threshold I stopped because something had occurred to me that I had not yet said. Lord Drazik made one error, I said, in his argument framework. He invoked Clause 47 of the original Blood Pact, but the original first draft treaty, not the ratified version. The first draft contains a counter provision in Clause 47 subsection that was incorporated into the final treaty by reference but was never separately transcribed into the standard copy. It is still legally binding. I believe it directly voids his entire argument. Cale did not turn from the window. I know, he said quietly. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, you were waiting to see if I would find it. I was waiting, he said, to see if there was anyone in your delegation worth speaking to. I left the observatory and walked back down the corridor of cosmic events, past the supernova and the galactic collision and the formation of the dark world below. My heart was moving faster than usual. My notebook was warm in my hands. I had been sent here to stand quietly and not embarrass anyone, I thought, with a deep and focused certainty that I was about to become the most inconvenient person in the known galaxy. I thought this with considerable satisfaction. The council session was called without warning on the 6th day. I was in the secondary archive room, a space I had found on the 2nd day and had since claimed as my unofficial working space, since no one else in the human delegation came there, and the veil attendants had stopped questioning my presence after I demonstrated, without making it obvious, that I understood the archive's organizational system well enough to use it correctly. I had a stack translated treaty documents in front of me and was working through the cross-referencing of Drazik's legal theory against the counter-provision I had identified, building the rebuttal argument piece by piece, when the attendant I had come to think of as the court's most efficient communicator appeared in the doorway. The inner council convenes in 1 hour. She said, Lord Drastic will present formal charges against the human tributary. She said it the way you say something to someone who has the right to know it, not the way you say it to a human envoy who should technically be receiving the information through her delegation's official communication channel. I looked at her. She had pale gray eyes and the careful expression of someone who had decided something and was not going to explain the decision. Thank you, I said. She left. I closed my documents, organized them in the precise sequence I would need them, and went to find Colin Hurst. He was in his suite in a moderate panic. The official notification had arrived through the diplomatic channel approximately 12 minutes earlier, and he had spent those 12 minutes moving between his desk and his window at a pace that suggested he had not yet identified a useful response. Drastic is filing emergency charges, he said when I walked in. He claims we've been militarizing in violation of Article 9. This is a catastrophe. We need to contact Earth. We need legal support. We need to be in that chamber in 43 minutes, I said. He looked at me. You're not a diplomat, Sarah. No, I said, I am going to be better than that. I am going to be prepared. I held up my stack of documents. He stared at them. I have been building a counter-argument since the second night, I said. Drastic's entire framework depends on a reading of Clause 47 that the original treaty's first draft does not support. I have the textual evidence. I have precedent, veiled jurisprudence from 3 comparable cases in the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the blood pact system. I have the argument. How do you? I read. I said, a great deal for a very long time. Can you walk into that chamber and trust me to handle this? He looked at me for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had spent his career managing situations he understood, and this was no longer a situation he understood. I have a better option. He said. No, I said, you don't. Council chamber was the most intimidating room I had ever stood in. 7 council members occupied a raised arc of stone seats, and below them the chamber floor was open space. Deliberate architectural choice, I knew, designed to make those presenting arguments feel exposed. The veil who sat in they were very old, all of them, in the way that great age shows not in weakness but in a quality of accumulated gravity, as if they had absorbed so much time that they had become dense with the Lord Drazik stood at the center of the floor. He was composed, confident, and clearly had not expected to see me walk in behind the human delegation. He had expected Colin Hurst. He had prepared his argument for Colin Hurst. He had not prepared it for me. He did not show his surprise. He was too experienced for that, but I saw the slight recalculation in his posture when he identified me. Fractional adjustment, the kind you make when the situation shifts in a direction you did not plan for. I sat at the human delegation's table and opened my documents. Drazik presented his case cleanly and well. He had a gift for the legal dialect's formal register, the precise, structured language that built arguments like architecture, each point supporting the next. He cited Article 9, Clause 47, the monitoring reports from the last 3 decades, and a set of data files showing what he claimed was evidence of human military development beyond the permitted defensive baseline. When he finished, the council chamber was quiet. The lead council member, an ancient woman named Vastra, whose age estimated at somewhere between 6 and 8 centuries, looked at our table. The human delegation may respond. Colin Hurst looked at me. I stood. I spoke in the court's legal dialect. There was an audible reaction in the chamber, not loud, not disruptive, but perceptible, the specific quality of silence that changes when something unexpected happens. Several council Members straightened almost imperceptibly. One of them, I noticed, exchanged a look with a colleague too. They're right. Drasik's jaw tightened by a fraction. I began with the counter provision. I laid it out the way I had spent 6 days, preparing to lay it out precisely, without rushing, citing the first draft, treaty text by section and line, explaining why it had been incorporated, by reference into the ratified version, explaining why that incorporation made it legally inseparable from the clause Drasik had invoked. I cited 3 historical cases from the Vale Zone, jurisprudential record, cases involving non-human tributary species in which the same counter provision had been applied, all 3 ruling against reclassification attempts. Then I addressed the data files. This was the part I had worked hardest on. The data files looked compelling. They had been designed to look compelling, but they had been constructed by someone who understood Vale data architecture and human institutional processes in the abstract without understanding the specific practical realities of how human colonial governments actually archived information in the 2290s. There was a formatting error. It was small. It was the kind of thing that would only be recognizable to someone who had spent time with actual human colonial records from that period, and I had, because I had spent a summer during university doing archival research for a professor who specialized in early colonial governance. The metadata timestamp format used in the files postdated the events the files claimed to document by 11 years. The files had been created recently and backdated. The backdating was precise in its major timestamps but had missed the minor format update that colonial archiving systems had implemented in 2301. I showed this to the council. I showed it in detail. I showed it without any expressions other than the focused attention of someone presenting technical information. That speaks entirely for itself. When I finished, the chamber was quiet in a different way. Drasik said with careful control, the human claims to have identified a technical discrepancy in the evidence. The council should not accept the word of a tributary species member against verified documentation. The documentation, I said without heat, verifies its own fabrication. I have not asked the council to take my word for anything. I have asked them to read the files they have already accepted into evidence and apply the archival standard that Vale records management protocols require for cross-species documentation review. If the council performs that review, they will find what I have described. My word is not the evidence. The files are the evidence. The files prove themselves false. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I was aware of my own heartbeat. Vostra, the lead council member, said, "The session will recess for review." The recess lasted 4 hours. I sat at the human delegation's table and drank water from the carafe that one of the court attendants placed in front of me, and I thought about nothing in particular, which was the mental state I had developed over years of high-pressure situations, not calm exactly, but a deliberate emptiness, a clearing of the space so that when I needed to think again, the space would be there. Colin Hurst sat beside me and said nothing. I appreciated that. When the council reconvened, Vostra spoke for 11 minutes. She reviewed the counter provision, accepted its application, reviewed the forensic analysis of the Data files accepted the evidence of fabrication, noted that this represented a serious violation of the council's integrity, and ruled that the reclassification motion was dismissed. She then said something that was not in any briefing document I had ever read. She said that the human delegation had demonstrated standard of legal preparation and scholarly rigor that exceeded the expected parameters for a tributary species envoy, and that the council would be formally noting this in the record. It was not a compliment. Exactly, it was more precise than that. It was an acknowledgement expected to happen in Vale court culture. Being formally noted in the council record was the equivalent of being seen by a room that had previously looked through you. I said thank you for the council's time, and then I sat down. It was only afterward in the corridor outside that Colin Hurst turned to me and said, with an expression I had never seen on his face before, open, slightly stunned, stripped of its usual careful management, "Sarah, what exactly are you?" I considered the question. "I am the person who read the documents," I said, "and then read them again." He laughed. It was a surprised laugh, not a polished one, and it made him seem younger and more real than anything I had seen from him in the previous 6 days. I went back to the archive room and wrote for 2 hours. When I had finished writing, I sat back and looked at the stack of documents that had saved humanity's legal standing in the Vale court. They were ordinary papers. They had been produced by an ordinary mind that had spent an ordinary number of years reading. There was nothing special about me. I had always known that. My parents had known it too. The difference between us was that they had concluded from this that I was without value, and I had concluded from it that value was not something you were given. It was something you built page by page in the long hours when no one was watching and nothing was required of you but your own curiosity. I thought about Cal Drawbridge standing at the observatory window, 4 centuries of accumulated time in the stillness of him, asking what I was, the person who showed up. I still thought that was the most honest answer I had. What I was beginning to suspect, sitting alone in the archive room with my documents and my notebooks, was that showing up was turning out to be considerably more complicated than I had planned. The morning after the council session, Lord Drassic was gone from the Ash Spire. I found out through the same gray-eyed attendant who had warned me about the council session. She appeared at the archive room door before breakfast and said that Lord Drassic had been removed from his court position and escorted to the outer station. Exile in veiled terms meant permanent removal from the court structure and a reduction of house standing that would take generations to recover from. It was not imprisonment. It was something the Vale considered worse, invisibility. I wrote it down. The human delegation spent the day in a state of collective stunned relief. Colin Hurst sent a full report to Earth. The response from my father when it eventually arrived in my personal message queue was 18 words long and read, "We are told you performed well. Your mother and I are pleased." I archived it in a folder I titled Documents of Historical Interest and did not respond. My sister Cal is in a separate message. Hers was longer. It said, "I heard what you did. I don't understand most of it. I don't think I would have been able to do it. I don't know what to say about that." It was the most honest thing Calla had ever said to I read it 3 times, I wrote back. A single line, get better, study the veil. They are worth understanding. I did not know if she would take the advice. I had done what I could with the words I had. The observatory meeting happened as scheduled. Kale was already there when I arrived, this time facing the door rather than the window, waiting. Rather than letting me find him in the act of looking elsewhere, he looked at me in the direct way that I had come to recognize as his default mode of attention, not the court performance of a ruler being observed by his court, but the plain attention of a person who has decided another person is interesting and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. The council has filed its record note. He said, I know, I said. The attendant told me she has been assigned to your corridor. I sat down in the chair by the window that had become, over the past several days, the chair I always sat in during these meetings. Did you assign her? Yes. Because you wanted someone keeping an eye on me, or because you wanted me to too? A source of information. He sat across from me. Both. I opened my notebook. There was something different about the room today, not the light, which was the same diffuse grayish dark that reflected from Nakatheron's black surface, not the temperature which never varied in the observatory, something in the quality of the air or in the way he was positioned in the chair with quality of decision about him, the posture of someone who has made up his mind about something and is choosing the right moment to say it. I want to ask you something, he said. All right, I said. What does it feel like? He said carefully, as if choosing each word with the precision I had come to recognize as his habit to have done. What you did yesterday, and then to have returned to your room and spent the evening in an archive room reading. I looked at him. I have been watching your species for 30 years, he said. I have met 63 human diplomatic delegations. In that time I have observed that when a human achieves something significant, the response is typically celebration, external recognition, a need to have the achievement acknowledged by others. He paused. You achieved something that will change the legal standing of your species for the foreseeable future. Then you went to the archive room and read. There was still work to do, I said. There is always still work to do, he said. That is not an answer. I set my pen down. I thought about the question honestly, which was the only way I knew how to think about things. I don't know how to be celebrated, I said. I have never been in a position where it was expected. I suppose I have spent so long working without acknowledgement that acknowledgement does not feel like part of the process. I paused. Also, there was a section of the veiled jurisprudential record from the 4th century that I had only partially reviewed, and the council's reference to a comparable case from that period indicated there might be a relevant precedent I had not yet found. I wanted to look for it. Did you find? Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, something astronomical moved in the deep distance, a slow sweep of light that might have been a comet or a vessel, or simply the edge of a statistic at the limits of the observatory's view. You are not what I expected, he said. You expected Kalen, I said. I expected a human diplomat, he said. I expected performance, practice, charm, the particular energy of someone who has been told they are representing something important and has clears throat, mistaken that for being something important. He looked at me steadily. Instead, I Received someone who showed up, unannounced with a cipher notebook, who survived a poisoning attempt and filed it away as a data point, and who destroyed a 4-year political operation through the application of archival research. I said, I am aware that this is unusual. It is not unusual, he said. It is unprecedented. The weight in the word was not the weight of exaggeration. It was the weight of someone for whom unprecedented was a meaningful category. Someone old enough that genuinely unprecedented things had become rare. I want to ask you something in return, I said. He inclined his head, which was the formal register's indication of permission to proceed. Why are you watching me? I said. Not the delegation, me specifically. You identified the discrepancy between my files and my appearance within the first hour. You could have had me removed. You could have sent the delegation back and demanded the correct envoy. You did not. You assigned a personal attendant to my corridor, and you invited me to a private meeting in the first language I had ever studied. I looked at him. Why? He looked at me for a long time, long enough that I began to count the seconds, not because I was uncomfortable, but because I was curious to see how long a 400-year-old king would take to answer a direct question. He took 41 seconds. Because he said, I have been alone in this court for a very long time, and I had forgotten what it felt like to speak to someone who was not afraid of me. And then you walked into my reception hall and looked at me like a problem you intended to solve, and I found I was not willing to send that away before I understood it. I held the stillness of that. I was aware of my heartbeat in the particular way that you become aware of something when it shifts to a new rhythm. I am not a problem you can solve, I said. No, he agreed. You are not. You are considerably more complicated than that. I picked my pen back up. Then we have something in common, I said. I find complicated things worth studying. 3 days later, Kala arrived. She came on a medical clearance transport, accompanied by 2 family advisors and a letter from my father explaining that the initial confusion about the delegation composition had been resolved and requesting that I return home and allow Kala to assume her rightful position. The letter had been drafted by a lawyer. It was very thorough. It had approximately no effect on me. I met Kala in the outer reception area. She was taller than I remembered, or perhaps I had simply not been paying attention before. She was very beautiful in the way she had always been beautiful, the kind of structured, presented that my mother had spent years cultivating. Polished and intentional, she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen her use on me before. Uncertain. You look different, she said. I am different, I said, or perhaps I was always this way, and you were not. Looking, she was quiet. Around us, the outer reception moved in its ordinary patterns. Court functionaries, minor diplomatic staff, the occasional low court veil on some errand of their own. No one paid particular attention to the 2 human women standing by the entrance. Arch, mother wants you home, Kala said. I know, I said. Father says it's time to stop making things complicated. I looked at my sister. I thought about what I wanted to say, and then I thought about how long I had spent in my life saying things that were softened for other people's comfort, and I decided that I was done with that particular practice. I'm not coming home, I said, and I am not stepping aside. What has happened? here in the last week is not something that can be handed over because the original plan has recovered from her illness. I am in the middle of something that matters, and the family scheduling preferences are not a factor I intend to weigh against that. Kala looked at me. Her expression went through several things quickly: offense, recalibration, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. They'll be angry, she said. Yes, I said. Are you afraid of that? I thought about the carafe with the poisoned water. I thought about the council chamber and Drax's tight jaw. I thought about 8 pages of notes written from memory in the dark. I have been afraid of considerably more specific things than my parents' disapproval, I said, and I managed those. Kala was quiet for a long moment. What is it like? She said. Finally, being here, doing whatever it is you're doing. The question was honest, more honest than anything she had said in the short time we had shared space as sisters, which had mostly consisted of her not asking me questions at all. It is the most interesting thing that has ever happened to me, I said, and then, because she had been honest with me, I added, it is also very frightening, and I am doing it anyway. She nodded slowly. She left that afternoon with the family advisors and the lawyer's letter, and I thought a somewhat altered understanding of who her sister actually was. I did not know if that would change anything between us. I thought it might. I filed it away for later. That evening Cal found me in the archive room, not through a message, not through the attendant. He came himself, which was apparently unusual enough that I found out later through 3 separate sources that the court's ambient intelligence network had registered it as an event worth noting. A king did not visit archive rooms, certainly not to speak to a human woman who was technically still a tributary species envoy and had no formal standing beyond that. He sat across from me at the archive table and said, "Your sister has left." "Yes," I said, "and your family's request, filed under correspondence, I have chosen not to act on." He looked at the documents spread across the table between us. He reached out and turned one of them toward himself, a 3rd century Vale legal treatise on non-human species integration, and read a page with the particular quality of attention that I had come to recognize as genuine engagement rather than performance. "There is something I need to tell you," he said. He set the document down. "I have been considering how to say it for several days." I put my pen down. He said, "There is a right ancient. It has not been invoked for 200 years because the circumstances that would require it have not arisen." He paused. "The blood claim is the formal declaration of a Vale King's chosen consort. It is permanent. It cannot be rescinded. There is, under the original blood pact framework, a reclassification provision for the chosen person species, not of the person themselves, but of their species standing in the Vale legal hierarchy. A blood claim consort species is automatically elevated to peer status." I was very still. "I want you to understand," he said, "that I am not telling you this as a political instrument. I am telling you this because you would eventually find it in the archive yourself, and I would rather you hear it from me first so that you understand that the political dimension is secondary to the reason I am considering it, and the reason," I said. "I have spoken to you for 8 days," he said honestly, "without the weight of a court, that is. afraid of me and therefore useless too. Me without the performance that this position requires from every other person in this building. He looked at me in the direct way that was simply his way of looking. I have not spoken honestly to anyone in a very long time. I had forgotten that it was possible. You reminded me. I looked at the man across the table, 412 years old, king of an ancient civilization, sitting in an archive room with a human woman who had shown up in someone else's clothes with a notebook full of cipher text. You should know, I said carefully, that I am not Kala. I am not what was planned. I am not graceful or trained or built for courts. I am someone who reads obsessively and notices things and cannot stop working even when the crisis is over. Yes, he said, I know, and you are asking anyway. I am telling you, he said. The asking would come separately, after you have had time to think about it. I looked down at the document he had set back on the table. 3rd century legal treatise, Naktoran archive number 7441. I had been reading it when he came in. How much time? I said. As much as you need, he said. I have 4 centuries of patience. I thought about my parents' house, the galas where I was in. Afterthought, the message that was 4 lines long, the 6 years I had spent reading about a civilization that no one expected me to understand, in the long evenings when no one was asking me to do anything and nothing was required of me but my own stubborn, insatiable curiosity. I will need to think, I said. Of course, he said. He stood, and before he left, he looked at the stack of documents on the table, my notebooks, my translated texts, the accumulated work of 8 days and 6 years, and he said, for what it is worth, whatever you decide, what you have done here has already changed things for your species permanently. You should know that, independent of everything else, I said. I know. He left. The archive room was quiet. I picked up my pen and opened my notebook to a fresh page. At the top I wrote, what do you do when the thing you have been preparing for turns out to be larger than the preparation? And then, below it, I began to think. The blood rite took place on the 17th day of my time in the ash spire in the great hall in front of the full court, broadcast on the diplomatic relay network to every species in the Vale political sphere. I know these facts because I wrote them in my notebook before the ceremony, as I was getting ready. In the way I wrote down everything, not to remember it later, but to understand it while it was happening. I was not wearing Kala's dress in the 3 days between Kale's visit to the archive room and the Saros Salsif. A court attendant had appeared with a selection of formal garments in the style of veil ceremonial dress, adapted for human proportions. I chose the simplest one, dark fabric, minimal ornamentation, nothing that would require me to think about how I was moving in it. Practical, all things considered. I stood in the antechamber outside the great hall and held my notebook and listened to the sounds of the court assembling on the other side of the doors. My hands were steady. My heartbeat was not. Both of these facts were true at the same time, and I had long since made peace with the idea that feeling afraid and continuing anyway was not bravery in the grand sense, but simply the basic function of being a person who refuses to stop. Colin Hurst appeared at my side. He had been told the previous day, and his reaction had been a long silence followed by a very careful look at me. Followed by, this is not in any protocol document I have ever read. And I had said, no, I expect not, and he had said, Earth is going to have a great deal to say about this, and I had said, they can say it, I have decided, and he had looked at me for another long moment and then said, good luck, Sarah. He had said my name with the same tone as the word itself, not Cale's name, not a substitution, mine. He was beside me now, and he said, ready? No, I said, I am going in anyway. The doors opened. The great hall was full. Every veil of standing in the ash fire was present, arranged in the formal order that I had memorized from the protocol documents. Inner council in the elevated arc, noble houses in the lateral wings, lower court filling the outer rings. The other alien delegations were present in their designated areas. The Queth diplomat, whose skills echo had gone silver with surprise when I spoke his language, was watching me with an expression I could read now. Reevaluation, recalculation, the particular attention of someone deciding what category to put you in when all their existing categories are wrong. Cale stood at the center of the hall, not on a raised platform on the floor. At the hall's axis, which was where the blood rite required the ceremony to take place, level grounded at the point where the geometry of the hall's construction converged, I had read the architectural specifications. The ash spire had been built around this point. I walked to the center of the hall and stopped 3 steps from him, which was the formal distance specified in the rites protocol, and I looked at him. And he looked at me. He said in the archaic court dialect the words of the blood claim. I had read them 12 times in the preceding 3 days, and I knew them as well as any text I had ever memorized, which was to say completely, with full comprehension of every clause and its historical implication. The words said, in their formal and ancient and precise way, I claim you as my equal, not my possession, not my property, my equal. The archaic dialect made a distinction that the modern veil language had collapsed, and the distinction mattered. The claim was not ownership, it was recognition. It said, I have found one person in all the time I have lived who is worth stake to, and I am standing next to them, and this is now a permanent truth about the world. When Finney finished, the rite required a response. The response in the original form was in the archaic dialect and consisted of 3 lines of acceptance. I said them. The pronunciation was correct. The intonation was correct. I had practiced the intonation with the intensity of someone who understood that this moment would be heard by 14-star systems, and that getting it wrong was not an option I was willing to entertain. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a very large room full of very old beings processing something they had not expected. Then the council lead Vostra said the formal words of acknowledgement that completed the rite, and the hall filled with the veil. Response, not applause, because the veil did not applaud, but the formal vocalization that their culture used in moments of witness to significance, a low sustained sound that resonated in the architecture and vibrated in my chest and sounded like something between a ceremony and a geological event. Cale looked at me, I looked at him. You practice the intonation, he said, quietly, for me alone, extensively. I said, was it frightening? Everything that matters is frightening, I said. That is how you know it matters. The formal installation happened over the following 2 days, a series of structured events that I processed with The same methodical attention I applied to everything, attending each one, completing each requirement, writing notes in the evenings about what each step meant in the broader context of Vale Court structure. On the second day of the installation proceedings, in a session of the inner council that was technically a formality but carried the actual legal weight of the transition, Vastra formally entered into the record the reclassification of humanity from tributary species to peer species. I was present for this. I was permitted to be present because the blood claim protocol entitled the consort to observe all proceedings affecting their species of origin. I sat in the observer's position and watched the council members enter their votes and listened to the clerk read the formal decision into the permanent record peer species. For the first time in 30 years, I did not celebrate. I wrote it down. Colin Hurst sent a message to Earth that I was told caused in the offices of the Diplomatic Relations Division something close to institutional chaos. I received over the following 3 days communications from 7 government offices, 4 news organizations, 2 universities, and my mother. I answered the universities. The others I filed. My mother's message said in full, "We always knew you were capable of great things, Sarah. We are very proud." It had taken 37 years and the reshaping of interstellar political history for her to write those words. I read them twice. I felt something that was not quite what I would have expected to feel, not the warmth of vindication, not the sharpness of anger, something quieter, a kind of settled completion, like a long equation that has finally reached its answer. I did not write back. There was nothing to add. Morning after the installation was complete, I went to the archive room. It was early. The ash spire's lights had barely shifted to their day setting. I sat at the table where I had spent most of the last 17 days, and I opened my notebook to a fresh page, and I thought about everything. I thought about the girl who had packed her bags alone in the dark and gone to a transit dock with no one to wave her off. I thought about the ship's corridor and Colin Hurst telling me to stay in the background. I thought about the poison carafe in the council chamber and 8 pages of reconstructed notes, and the moment in the observatory when I answered in a dialect that had not been spoken aloud in 100 years, and the silence that followed. I thought about what it means to be the person nobody wanted. It does not mean you are without value. It means the people assigning value have made an error. The distinction is important. I had taken a long time to understand it. I understood it now, sitting in the archive room of the Ash Spire, queen of nocturne, pure representative of the human species, with my notebook open on the table and a new page waiting. 3 weeks later, I established the first human embassy with full diplomatic standing inside the Ash Spire. I selected the staff myself, not diplomats in the traditional sense, not people with political connections or family prestige. I selected 4 recent graduates from xenolinguistics programs, a historian who specialized in non-human treaty law, and a woman named Pippa Harlow who had spent 8 years doing archival research on early blood pact documentation, and who, when I contacted her, said I didn't think anyone had read my work, in a voice that I recognized completely. I read everything I told her. She arrived 3 weeks after that with 12 boxes of research materials and a focused contained energy that I recognized as the particular quality of a person who has spent a long time being told their work is too niche to matter. I gave her the archive room. She looked at it the way I had looked at it on the second day, with the expression of someone who has just been given the right key to a lock they have been working at for years. I trained the team in everything I had learned, not in the performance of diplomacy, in the substance of it, the languages, the history, the etiquette. That was not etiquette, but was instead an entire civilization's accumulated logic about how people should treat each other in moments of consequence. I told them, you will be underestimated. Use that, but more importantly, be so prepared that the underestimation stops. Be so prepared that they have to recalculate. That is the only kind of power that cannot be taken from you. I thought about my father's house when I said it. I thought about a lot of things. The Ver arrived in the Ashfall 4 months into my tenure. They were an old species, older than the Queth, nearly as old as the Vale, and they wore their the way some old things do, loudly, in the form of dismissiveness toward everything younger. They had never interacted with humanity in any formal capacity. They looked at the human embassy staff the way you look with something decorative that you have not been asked to admire. Their senior diplomat at the formal introductory reception said something to his attaché in the Ver trade dialect, a language with an estimated 3,000 living speakers in the galaxy, none of them human, as far as he was aware, about the entertainment value of watching short-lived species attempt to conduct diplomacy. I was sitting at the human embassy table, reviewing the morning's correspondence. I did not look up. I said in the Ver trade dialect, with the specific tonal markers of their northern regional variant. The trade dialect's northern register marks that observation as informal rather than official. I treated accordingly. The sound that the V'her diplomat made was not something I had a translation for. It was involuntary. That was all I could say about it with certainty. I looked up. Then I met his eyes. Welcome to the Ash Spire, I said. I have reviewed your delegation's treaty history with the Val going back to the third compact. I found the fourth compact's arbitration clause particularly interesting. I believe your house's position on non-binding mediation was mischaracterized in the standard record. I would be glad to discuss the primary sources with you when your schedule allows. The silence lasted long enough to be satisfying. I went back to my correspondence. Later that evening I stood in the observatory where all of it had begun. The dark side of Nocturne spread below, its slow pulse of bioluminescence moving in the deep geological dark. Kale stood beside me, not speaking, in the way of someone comfortable enough with another person to share silence without needing to fill it. I thought about what I would say if someone asked me after everything, after the council chamber and the blood right and the 4 months of building something from nothing in an ancient court that had not expected me, what it all meant. I thought I would say they called me unwanted. They were not wrong. My family did not want me. The diplomatic world did not want me. The court did not expect me. The galaxy, in its enormous and ancient indifference, had no particular place set aside for a human woman who read too much and wrote everything down and refused to accept the version of herself that other people had decided was the definitive one. Unwanted is not the same as unneeded. I had always known. The difference, I had just been waiting for the moment when knowing it would matter. I was still waiting in a sense. Not passively, never passively, but waiting in the active, purposeful way of someone who has made a place for herself in the world and knows that the place is not finished yet, that there is still more to build, more to read, more to understand. I was waiting in the way of someone who has realized that the work does not end when you have one, it just becomes more interesting. I opened my notebook, I turned to a fresh page, and I began